Welcome back to The Discoverers. This is Chapter 78, The Shock of the Primitive. During the centuries after Las Casas, European debate over the levels of humanity moved from theology to biology. By classifying all mankind as a single species, Homo sapiens, Linnaeus seemed in the mid-18th century to join the party of Las Casas. He gave his own clear answer to the question debated at Valladolid in 1550, but he fogged the issue for European settlers in remote parts when he listed 5 kinds of Homo sapiens: wild man, American, European, Asiatic, African, quote, varying by education and situation, end of quote. Were these different varieties of a single human species? If so, what did variety mean? When the assessment of man's capacities moved from religion to science, questions changed from wholesale to retail. Like the earlier movement from cosmology to geography, this too was a move toward incrementalism. Instead of asking the grand monolithic question debated by Las Casas and Sepulveda about the nature of man and his destiny in this and the afterlife, now they would ask countless questions about the trivia of daily life. Unlike theology texts that were written in a learned language, the data of anthropology were everybody's experience. Focus shifted from human nature to human cultures, from metaphysics to miscellany. Questions of anthropology would be asked and answered not in the library, but out in the world. Every human society became a laboratory. And the New World would be the first for this new science of mankind. Here, large numbers of permanent European settlers lived alongside Stone Age communities. Just as Las Casas had applied Christian theology to his New World encounters with strange people, so in the early 19th century, observers equipped with new institutions for exchanging the data of science would study the American natives. A strength of this enterprise was precisely that it was new. All inquirers had the naivety, and some had the boldness of amateurs. The opportunities and the temptations were dramatized in the career of one passionate amateur, Lewis Henry Morgan, 1818 to 1881. Son of a farmer in a frontier village of central New York, on the path of the newly constructed Erie Canal, he was an emphatically sociable young man. At school, he organized a society for, quote, mutual improvement in useful knowledge, end of quote, the Erodefison Society. Graduating from Union College in Schenectady in 1840, he returned to read law in Aurora. A young lawyer without clients in the doldrums of the business depression that began in 1837, he had ample time for his clubbable talents. He founded a secret lodge for sociability and self-improvement, which met in an abandoned Masonic lodge building. Morgan christened his club the Order of the Gordian Knot, for it was an age of classical revival. Ancient Greece and Rome offered models in architecture and synonyms for the best in civilization commemorated in town names like Ithaca, Troy, Delphi, Hannibal, Marcellus, Brutus, Cato, Syracuse, Utica, and Aurora. As his members dispersed from Aurora, they formed branches, and within a few years, the order had 500 members in a dozen towns. In 1843, Morgan decided to abandon the ancient classical format for one more distinctly American. Quote, Gordius conceived the mighty enterprise of leading his Phrygian children to this western hemisphere, Morgan explained, conducted them to Bering Strait, thence across to this western world, end of quote. The Order of the Gordian Knot became the Grand Order of the Iroquois, with Morgan as the chief, called Shenandoah, after an Iroquois who had befriended the Americans during the Revolution. The source of Morgan's first Indian enthusiasm is not clear. Perhaps it started in pure whimsy, but soon enough he proved his serious desire to capture the spirit of the Iroquois. The 5 tribes of the Iroquois had traded with the first European settlers who moved west, then fought savagely to resist their invasion. Most of the Iroquois had sided with the British during the Revolution, and when the war ended, they were forced to surrender their lands in exchange for token payments and confinement on reservations. Morgan's grandfather's 600-acre family farm had been carved from Iroquois land as a reward for his services in the Revolution. In 1843, when Morgan decided to commemorate the Indians' lost cause in his secret society, he knew little about the inner workings of Iroquois life. But this did not prevent his elaborating complicated Iroquois quote-unquote rituals. In his solemn initiation ceremony, which he called initiation, the blindfolded candidate was warned, quote, "If in an idle hour or with careless levity you should dare to lift the veil of secrecy from our order and expose it to the paleface, a retribution the very thought of which would make you shudder even in the grave will follow quick upon your erring footsteps." End of quote. At the meetings, Morgan's quote-unquote warriors wore Iroquois-style leggings and headdress, carried tomahawks, and scorning all who talked, quote, with forked tongue, end of quote, they spoke in what they believed were Indian figures of speech. To instruct their fraternity, Morgan boldly invited Henry Schoolcraft, 1793 to 1864, the nation's leading authority on Indians, whose work would enter American folklore as the basis of Longfellow's Hiawatha. Schoolcraft had married a woman of Ojibwa extraction, had negotiated the treaty in which the Ojibwas ceded much of northern Michigan, and then he became Michigan's superintendent of Indian affairs. Addressing the Grand Order of the Iroquois, Schoolcraft urged the Aurora quote-unquote warriors not to be satisfied by studying only their European heritage. They should turn to, quote, the history and antiquities and institutions of the free, bold, wild, independent native hunter race. They are relatively to us what the ancient Pict and Celt were to Britain or the Teuton, Goth and Magyar were to continental Europe, end of quote. Morgan himself had already determined to study the Indians firsthand. A personable young Iroquoian of the Seneca tribe, whom he had met browsing in an Albany bookstore, gave him his entree. Eli Parker, son of a chief, had gone to a Baptist mission school and then had been sent to law school by his tribe so that he could defend them against further removal. This time they were threatened with removal beyond the Mississippi. Morgan's Grand Order joined the Iroquois cause, raised money, organized meetings, and signed petitions. Morgan and Parker went to Washington to persuade the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs to give relief from a quote-unquote treaty that had appropriated Indian lands worth $200 an acre for a mere $2.50 an acre. The treaty had been signed by a majority of the tribe's chiefs and sachems. In one of the first applications of anthropology to Indian affairs, Parker and Schoolcraft testified that the Indians lived by the rule of unanimity and knew nothing of majority rule. Despite overwhelming evidence of fraud, the Senate refused to abrogate the treaty. Only after another decade of protest, the Senate belatedly authorized the Iroquois to buy back their acreage and appropriated funds for the purpose. Morgan's trip to Washington persuaded him that Iroquois customs could not long survive. At the same time, he had earned the confidence of the Iroquois. On his return in October of 1846, he visited the Corn Harvest Festival on the Tonawanda Reservation and was adopted into the Hawk clan of the Seneca tribe. Christened Tayadawuka, one lying across, he was to link Indians and whites. He seized his opportunities, and with passionate nostalgia, a poignant sense of injustice, and omnivorous curiosity, he began gathering data, as he explained, from, quote, those human tablets on which are inscribed the closing events in the career and the destiny of the old Iroquois, end of quote. From his small-town fraternal beginning, Morgan set out on an enterprise of worldwide discovery. The later career of Morgan's Iroquois friend Eli Parker was itself a saga. In Washington on his lobbying trip, the charming Parker had delighted President Polk as a dinner companion. Although Parker had mastered the law, still because he was not a citizen, he was refused admission to the bar. Undismayed, he entered Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute to become an engineer and was hired as superintendent of construction on the government works at Galena, Illinois. There he had the good luck to meet and impress a ne'er-do-well veteran of 10 years Army service, Ulysses S. Grant, who was clerking in a leather store owned by his brothers. When the Civil War broke out in April of 1861, Parker's friend Grant had trouble finding himself a suitable Army assignment. Parker sought a commission, but Secretary Seward told him that the whites could easily win the war on their own and needed no help from Indians. The indomitable Parker managed anyway to secure a commission as captain of engineers and soon became Grant's military secretary. At Appomattox Courthouse, when surrender was being negotiated with General Lee, the senior adjutant was so nervous that he could not write out the terms. Grant ordered Parker to revise Grant's penciled original and then write clean copies, which became the official documents of surrender signed by General Lee to end the Civil War. Grant commissioned Parker a brigadier general for his gallant and meritorious services, and later, as president, appointed him Commissioner of Indian Affairs. When Morgan became a serious student of Iroquois tribal life, he was increasingly troubled by the, quote, merriment and irrelevancy, end of quote, of the Grand Order. In 1846, he gave up the management, and the society fell apart. But Morgan had already become the nation's leading authority on the Iroquois. He sent his collection of Iroquois objects, mortars and pestles, chisels, knives, tomahawks, kettles, necklaces, pipes, and drums, to Albany for a new Indian museum. Morgan's League of the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, published in 1851, was acclaimed by knowledgeable contemporaries as, quote, the first scientific account of an Indian tribe ever given to the world, end of quote. In retrospect, too, it is plain that Morgan pioneered a new science of mankind. And there we'll stop for the end of part 1. See you in part 2.